Yes, we're live.
Hello, and welcome to another show of Meat of the Matter. I'm your host, Victoria Olson, with Mark Ennis and Peter Vanderplas. And our guest today, our honored guest, is Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. Dr. Kendrick is a GP, he's a researcher, and he's an author. He's written 4 books called The Great Cholesterol Con, The Clot Thickens, A Statin Nation, and Doctoring Data. Dr. Kendrick is the researcher who, almost a decade ago, has a famous meta-analysis of heart disease studies that brought to light that people with higher cholesterol can actually live longer. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kendrick. We're very honored to have you with us today.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here, or wherever here is, somewhere
In the
in the
air.
virtual world nowadays.
Yeah. Okay, Malcolm. I want to start off with this. There's going to be an awful lot of new people that are listening to this podcast, and I'm pretty sure they've all heard the myth about cholesterol and saturated fat, the likes of red meats and eggs and too much fat in the diet. So let's start off with there. What are your views on this?
Well, I started looking at heart disease 40 years ago. I know it's hard to believe. I look so young, but I was interested in what caused heart disease, and obviously we were told. Well, I'm from Scotland, and at the time, Scotland had the highest rate of death from heart disease or cardiovascular disease, or whatever term you want to use for it, in the world. Second, well, Northern Ireland was up there as well. It's not the case anymore, but I was very interested in it, and we were all told the same thing at medical school. It's because of our terrible Scots diet, and we eat whatever our diet was actually supposed to be. Saturated fat was mentioned, and that raised your cholesterol level, and that caused heart disease. So I started looking into it, and within about a week, I thought, this just doesn't make any sense. This is wrong. It's nonsense. Because one of the places that I visit quite a lot is France. I don't know if you've ever been there, but they eat a lot of saturated fat, and at the time were renowned in Europe for having the lowest rate of heart disease in Europe. So I started looking at France. I started looking at all the other countries in Europe. I started looking around the world and realized that, you know what, it's complete bunk. It just doesn't make any sense. First of all, I mean, I didn't know much about the biochemical processes involved, but I just looked at the data and I thought, no, this is just it's rubbish. This was a time before the internet, so I thought I was pretty much the only person in the world who thought this. And then started speaking to some other people. Eventually, got in touch with a group called the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, Thinks, which was set up by Uffe Ravneskov, Swedish doctor, a brilliant guy who wrote a book called The Cholesterol, I think it was The Cholesterol Myths, where he said, well, you know, the idea that cholesterol causes heart disease is complete bunk as well, which I already knew because I'd looked again at the statistics around the world, and it just, wherever you looked, it just didn't make any sense. In fact, in Scotland, they did a thing called the Scottish Heart Health Study. Started in the late 1980s. And one of the outstanding findings was there was no association between cholesterol levels and heart disease in that population, in the population with the highest rate of heart disease in the world. And then you looked at things like the Framingham study, which was started in America. It's a town near to Boston called Framingham, where they got everybody in the town and said, let's look at their height and their weight and their sex and their smoking and their everything, and see which things are related to dying of heart disease. And they're the ones that came out and said, oh, well, it's their cholesterol level is the most important factor. Well, it never was. It was smoking was the most important factor. And then you started looking at the data, and it was Uffe Ravneskov who first sort of stripped it apart and said, well, did you know that during this study started in 1948, by the way, so it's been going on for a long time. During the first 20 years of that study, if your cholesterol level fell, the people whose cholesterol level fell the most were the people whose rate of heart disease went up the most, which completely contradicted everything that, again, we were told. So the study itself, the Framingham study that was used to support the cholesterol hypothesis, actually contradicted the cholesterol hypothesis. One of the chaps that set that up was Dr. George Mann, who then went off to study the Maasai villagers of Kenya, who ate nothing but fat. Well, the men ate They drank milk, they drank blood, they ate bits of cow. If you're going to be a real Maasai warrior, you didn't eat a vegetable to save your life, right? Because this is what you were. Not a proper Maasai diet. I think they drank yogurt. And anyway, their entire diet was full of animal and saturated fat. And when he went there, he couldn't find a single case of any Maasai villager dying of heart disease. And he actually set up a group called the Veritas Society that said the whole idea is just complete bunk. He helped to set up the Framingham study. He left it because he said it's complete nonsense. But you'll find this sort of pattern emerges where people find or they come to a conclusion that saturated fat has nothing to do with heart disease. Saturated fat and cholesterol have nothing to do with heart disease. And then pretty rapidly they're removed from the mainstream discussion and no one dares mention them anymore. So you are left as a bit of a sort of voice in the wilderness when you start looking at this stuff.
And I just want to touch a little bit on LDL because I know you talk a lot about this, and I know there's many forms of LDL. But why do doctors keep on going on about this? Because from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, LDL only becomes a problem when you add sugar to it. Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't LPA the problem and not LDL the problem?
Oh well, I don't know how much your audience know of these areas, but LDL is low density lipoprotein because just explained it. Cholesterol is insoluble in water, therefore insoluble in blood, so it has to be carried about in a little taxi, which is called a lipoprotein. There's many different forms of lipoprotein, but the one that is supposed to cause heart disease is the LDL, the low density lipoprotein. Why they chose this one, well, your guess is as good as mine, but they did. But there is another lipoprotein called LPA, which is actually an LDL molecule with an extra protein attached to it. So it's the evil twin, if you like, of LDL. There will be a lot more interest in this in the near future because a couple of pharmaceutical companies are trying to and have created drugs that can lower LPA. They do the usual thing. They go in and change the sequencing in your DNA, which is who knows what that will end up doing. However, the important point about LPA is that you can't tell the difference between it and LDL. Well, you can tell the difference, but if you looked at, say, a thickening in an artery and found LDL, well, actually, you might be finding LPA. How would you know the difference? Well, the only way you know the difference is by specifically looking for the protein that's attached to LPA.
Yeah.
So LDL has a protein attached called apolipoprotein B100. LPA has that protein attached plus this apolipoprotein A. So it's got two big proteins stuck to the side of it. Now, if you don't look for that protein, you won't see it. You won't even know it's there. There was a couple of researchers, one of whom was Linus Pauling. And people who'd had coronary artery bypass grafts, so they got a bit of their artery taken out and another bit put in and bypassing the blockage. They studied the bits of artery that were taken out and stained them for this specific LPA protein, apolipoprotein A, and found it was there in an equal amount to apolipoprotein B. Now, people found apolipoprotein B100 and said, oh, it's LDL that's in there. So, well, it could be. Well, it could actually be VLDL or it could be LPA. It doesn't have to be LDL. So they're like, it was like the wrong suspect. You know, it wasn't me. It was my evil twin brother that was there. But they didn't look at this. People don't even look at it. They've just started to look at this. This work was done by Linus Pauling 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The problem with that is that he worked with a guy called Linus Matthias Rath, who you may or may not have heard of. But he became persona non grata because he said that there was no such thing as HIV, or if there was, you should treat it with vitamins and you shouldn't be using antiviral drugs. So he's now about as popular as Andrew Wakefield in mainstream medicine. So he did this work with Pauling, and the work was published, and they said, "Is this protein?" Now you might say, "Well, so what's that got to do with the price of beans? Why does this protein matter?" Well, the fascinating thing about that protein is it's identical to a protein you find within all blood clots, and that protein is called plasminogen. And you might have heard of Clotbusters. Tissue plasminogen activator is a Clotbuster. They were used a lot more maybe 20 years ago. If people were having a heart attack or a stroke, they used to inject them with TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. And that activated plasminogen, which turned it into plasmin, which sliced the blood clots apart and removed them. So that was a clot buster, right? So that's a part of the whole sequence of blood clotting in your body. It's a really complicated system. The interesting thing about the protein attached to LPA is that although it is chemically identical, it's folded in a different way. Protein folding you may have heard of with prions in the brain. So if you start folding proteins in different ways, they have completely different effects, right? So when an enzyme comes along to a protein that looks like that, and it fits into it, and it makes it work, and it splits it apart, it does its enzyme things. But if you turn the protein around like that, then it can't attach. It's exactly the same structure, but it can't attach. There's racemic mixtures and all sorts of things. So if you fold the protein differently, or you just stick the index finger up like that, or you put another 2 index fingers out and not these, again, it can't attach. And this is what apolipoprotein A is. It's exactly the same as plasminogen, except it's not folded the same way. So when TPA comes along to a clot that's got this LPA protein attached, it can't break down the clot, or it finds it much more difficult to break down the clot. So essentially, whatever clot has formed is much more resilient and potentially therefore dangerous. It's more difficult to remove, and it's more difficult to break down, because the breakdown systems in the bodies don't work on it, or they don't work as well on it. And you might ask yourself, well, what the hell's that doing there? Why is that there? What's the purpose of such a thing? And when you start looking at the body in the way that I like to, which is, well, why the hell would it be there? And this is what, in fact, Pauling and Rath said, was that basically 40 million, I'm sorry, this story is getting complicated. 40 million years ago, certain animals, certain mammals lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C. So we can't make it. Almost all animals can make vitamin C, but we can't. There's about certain fruit bats and guinea pigs and a few apes can't do this either. And we can't. We're in a lineage that can't do this. Which is not a problem, because normally we get enough vitamin C in our diet all the time. It doesn't really matter. But you know that when sailors used to sail across the seas in days gone by, they would get scurvy because they couldn't get enough vitamin C. And one of the biggest problems if you don't have enough vitamin C is that vitamin C is required to make collagen. So there will be a test on this at the end. Collagen is like the steel bars in concrete, essentially, and it's throughout your whole body. You're full of collagen. In fact, sharks are made of collagen. They don't have bone. To give you some idea that collagen is quite important. And the first thing that starts to break down if you don't have vitamin C and collagen is your blood vessels. So they start to crack. And as they crack, you start to bleed. So the first symptom, visible symptom of scurvy, is you have bleeding gums. But obviously everything else is bleeding as well. And eventually you bleed to death internally. That's how scurvy kills you, all right? So their hypothesis is, and you can find this, is that if you don't have enough vitamin C and your blood vessels start to crack open, it would be quite nice to have a plug, glue to hold them together, if you like. Because that would stop you bleeding to death at times when you don't have enough vitamin C. So it becomes a survival advantage. And that is what they believe, and I believe this is true as well, is the purpose of LPA is to find cracks in your blood vessels, cover them over, and stick to them quite hard, so you don't then bleed and lose blood all over the place. All right? So that's the purpose of LPA. Animals that don't synthesize their own vitamin C they have LPA, and other animals don't. So it's not 100%. All right.
It sounds like vitamin C for this reason is very important for heart health, right? I mean, you prefer to have intact vessels instead of LPA repaired vessels.
Once the vessel, well, for the short term, having these sort of sticky patches on your blood vessels is a good idea. In the long term, if you keep sticky patching your blood vessels, you're going to end up with as you may know, I believe that the thickenings and the plaques in your arteries are due to blood clots that have stuck to your artery walls. and then are covered over. But the ones that don't heal up fully, the ones that aren't removed fully, can become the focus for further blood clot building up. So obviously, if you have LPA, doesn't damage the artery wall. So if you're not damaging your artery walls, then LPA has no impact whatsoever. It's only once you start damaging the artery walls by things like smoking and high blood pressure and high blood glucose and whatever, that LPA becomes a problem. So LPA increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by around threefold, should we say, but not in everybody, clearly. And some people have very high levels of LPA and some people have quite low levels of LPA. That's genetically determined. Up till now, it's been impossible to really do much about that level. Rath and Pauling said you should take lots of vitamin C every day, and that will stop you ever having heart disease. I don't believe that's true, but I do believe, obviously, it wouldn't be a bad thing to do. Now, especially as when you get a viral infection or any form of infection, your body really burns through vitamin C quite quickly. And a lot of these infections actually damage your blood vessel walls. So SARS-CoV-2, for instance, the reason why it caused the problems it did was it was attracted to a particular protein on the cells that line your blood vessels, the endothelial cells. That's how it gained entry. It gains entry through a thing called an A2 receptor. Then the virus is in your cell, it's in your endothelial cell, and it's growing. And at that point, your cell says, I've been infected. Please come and kill me, to the immune system. The immune system revs itself up and starts attacking all the cells that are infected, and starts wiping them out. Now, of course, once you do that, then you'll get blood clots throughout your cardiovascular system. Now, at the same time, the cells are burning through vitamin C to keep themselves going. So if you feed people vitamin C when they're infected, so if you've got, I mean, SARS-CoV-2 isn't the only virus that does this. Most influenza viruses will do this. So influenza A and B damage the cells in your blood vessels. So if you're taking vitamin C, it helps to stimulate and protect them as well. And also other kind of bacterial, you've heard of sepsis, everyone's heard of sepsis. And that sepsis is where you get bacteria in your bloodstream. And then bacteria start to multiply in your bloodstream. And then they start to release toxins, exotoxins, external toxins. These are basically just the waste products of bacteria, right? As they release these exotoxins, obviously the first cells that they come across are the cells lining your blood vessels. Right? So they start stripping these cells apart, and you start getting clotting throughout your entire cardiovascular system, which is why if you see people who've got meningitis or have had sepsis, they can quite often lose their fingers and the tips of their nose and things. That's because their small blood vessels are just destroyed. The circulation is seriously damaged, and again, that's what kills them. So sepsis and viral infections and all these things are having the same effect, and it's creating blood clots. Now, obviously, if you have a lot of LPA kicking around, if you're not in sepsis, we're not talking sepsis for most people. What you're trying to do is to avoid these blood clots being constantly created on your blood vessels, and especially if it then attracts LPA, because LPA has the protein also is attracted to the underlying surface of the blood vessel and bonds to it very strongly, and it's very difficult to get it removed at that point. So the only thing you can then do if you've got an LPA bonded to the side of your blood vessels is to cover it over with a new layer of endothelial cells. And then that means that the clot is drawn into the artery wall, at which point the repair systems come to try and chop it up. But then they have a problem because LPA with this special protein is more difficult to break down. So it's more difficult to break down these blood clots. So they're more difficult to remove. And so they gradually will build up in your arteries, thickening them and narrowing them. I hope I haven't confused the hell out of everybody here, but
it made sense. I kind of had an idea what I was about, but yeah, you're after clearing it very, very well. So what number should people be looking for? Like what blood markers should people be looking for?
Well, I think I don't care about lipid, I don't care about LDL, I don't care about cholesterol. The LPA, I mean, you could say you could worry about it, but what can you do about it? Well, there are some people say that you can lower it down a bit if you take a lot of vitamin C. I don't think it's very clear that you can. It's a bit like saying I'm 5'8". How can I become 6'2"? Well, I'm sorry, but you're 5'8". You aren't going to be 6'2", you know. Or I'm 6'6" and I want to be 5'2". Well,
Yeah.
you're 6'6". So it's a bit of a pointless thing in a way. What you're trying to do is say, well, if you've got a high LPA, make sure you don't damage your blood vessels. And you go,
Yeah.
okay, so how do I avoid damaging my blood vessels? Well, there's lots of answers to that, because you've got to say then, okay, what damages blood vessels? Well, off the top of my head, I did this the other day, and I got to 93 just thinking about it, and that might worry people, just like, but a lot of them you're not going to have to worry about, because it's never going to happen to you, right? But the big ones you have to worry about are a high blood sugar level, because a high blood sugar level damages the lining of your blood vessels in all sorts of different ways. So if you've got a high blood sugar level, you've got diabetes, that's the thing I would worry about. How can you deal with that? Well, probably the people here know that we stop eating so many carbohydrates, you idiot, you know, which is pretty obvious. Well, insulin itself also damages the lining of the blood vessels. A high insulin level is possibly actually more damaging than the high sugar level.
Oh.
All right, there's a lot of paper. I've just been looking at a bunch of papers on this as well. So you don't want to have a high blood sugar level. Definitely not. Now, clearly, having a high blood pressure causes increased turbulence and flow and all sorts of things. So having a high blood pressure is not a great thing. And some of the classic things that will damage your blood vessels are smoking, yes. Air pollution, yes. Wood smoke fires, unfortunately, because I like wood fire smoke. So what happens here is that if you smoke or you inhale smoke from a wood burning fire or air pollution, is that your lungs are relatively leaky, at least to very small particles, nanoparticles. So these nanoparticles get into your lungs, and then they travel out of your lungs into your bloodstream. All right. And in fact, studies done on healthy volunteers have shown that if you smoke one cigarette, a healthy volunteer smoking one cigarette, and you can measure the breakdown products of the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels, you are actually killing you're killing endothelial cells by smoking. Now, at the same time, the repair process is kicking. So you get new blood vessels, you get new endothelial cells are produced, primitive endothelial cells, and the whole thing gets cleared up. But you can imagine if you're smoking a cigarette, then you smoke another one, then you smoke another one, then you smoke another one, then your repair systems are having to work pretty hard at this point to keep your cardiovascular system healthy. Same thing with air pollution. Diesel particulate fumes are particularly small, and they get into your lungs and they get out of your lungs. I mean, people say, oh, how can things get out of your lungs? You may know or may not know that one time they were going to use inhaled insulin for diabetes, because insulin can get out of your lungs and into your bloodstream. That actually died a death because you couldn't get the dosages remotely right. Some people 70% of it got absorbed, and some people 2% or whatever it was. So they decided you couldn't actually do this. So yes, things get into your lungs, they get out of your lungs, they get into your blood, you get into your bloodstream, and obviously the first thing that a toxic chemical is going to hit is going to be the lining of your blood vessels, and they're the things that take the hit. And when they take the hit, they die. Some of the cells die, and when a cell dies, when a cell lining your blood vessels dies, it exposes the underlying blood vessel, and it also exposes a thing called tissue factor, which is the most potent clotting agent in nature. Tissue factor is like super glue. Bang. The moment the bloodstream is exposed to tissue factor, it clots like that instantly, really quickly. It has to, because what the body thinks at that point is that blood vessel's been damaged. So if, say, you were being attacked by a lion or a tiger or something, then bits of your blood vessels are going to be exposed, and you have to not bleed to death, and you have to do that quite quickly. So if you get a paper cut, a very thin cut, it can bleed and it can bleed and it can bleed, and that's because actually you've done a very thin cut and you haven't really exposed the blood vessels to the blood. But if you tear a blood vessel, it clots very, very quickly. So if you tear or damage the lining of blood vessels, they release tissue factor, and tissue factor causes clots to form instantly, very quickly. It bypasses you've always heard this factor 8 and 9 and 7 and 5 and all that stuff. That's a slow process. The quick process is this extrinsic factor. So anyway, if you damage blood vessels, blood clots form. No one disagrees with that. That's a well-known thing, right? That's central science, if you like. So what are the biomarkers you've got to worry about? Well, biomarkers will, if you depend, high blood sugar level is a biomarker. You know, HbA1c is a biomarker. It's just a biological marker of something in your blood. Can you measure the amount of cigarette smoke in your blood? Well, actually, you can, sort of. There's a way of measuring that. But you already know if you're smoking, you're smoking. I mean, no one needs to tell you, oh my goodness, you're smoking. Did you realize? You know, yes, I did realize. Other things that can really damage the lining, weirdly, I've just been writing a lecture about this for somebody, is if you don't eat enough salt, NaCl salt. There are many different salts. Now, if you don't eat enough salt, this triggers a whole series of processes in your body, triggered mainly by the kidney. The kidney goes, because if you don't eat enough salt, your blood volume goes down, if you like, right? And then your body starts to create a whole system of hormones are factored in. So you'll get, you may have heard of aldosterone, you may have heard of angiotensin, you might have heard of angiotensin 2, you might have heard of renin. There's a thing called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. If you don't eat enough salt, your body will try to regulate it, bring it back in, will also narrow your blood vessels, will do a whole series of things that are all quite damaging to your cardiovascular system. And I can't show you that. I can show you a graph that basically comes from the nutritional study from the States, that people who eat less than 2.5 grams of sodium a day have an almost doubled mortality rate from people who eat twice that much. How's that happening? Because you're damaging your blood vessels, because the way that the body deals with having not enough sodium in it is to release hormones that are actively damaging to your blood vessels. So eat salt, but not sodium particularly necessarily. Eat potassium, because the balance between potassium and sodium is absolutely critical. And what has happened now is we're not eating enough potassium, so the balance between potassium and sodium has gone off kilter. And this is causing our kidneys to go bonkers and release all sorts of hormones that then go around the body, knackering it. So you have to look at that. Other things that are very important, that one of the most important substances, chemical compounds, is called nitric oxide. If you've heard of it, NO minus. People say free radicals are bad for you. There's nothing freer or more radical than nitric oxide. It should be a gas. No one believed it could exist in the human body, but it was found to exist in the human body, and it does all sorts of incredibly important things. And one of the most important things it does is it helps to produce new endothelial cells in the bone marrow. It's enormously powerful anticoagulant. It triggers a whole series of different systems in your body that nurture and help your endothelial cells. And the thing that most people have never heard of, the thing that lines all your blood vessels, is a thing called, it's a little forest called the glycocalyx. If you try and pick up a fish, not all fish, not a shark, if you try and pick up a fish, it slips through your fingers. That's because it's covered in glycocalyx, which is slippery, it's protective. It's not in this case anticoagulant, but it is inside us. Inside our blood vessels, we have 5,000 square meters of blood vessel lining in our body, which is 20 tennis courts, right? Which is almost impossible to believe, isn't it? All right. Every single micromillimeter of your blood vessels is lined with glycocalyx, glucose protein matrix, which is a bit like a lawn, and it lines your blood vessels and it protects them, and it makes everything slip through much more quickly. It's where nitric oxide is synthesized. It contains anticoagulant molecules. It's just a fabulously important part of your body, and especially your cardiovascular system. And I do this occasionally for my own amusement, as I ask doctors, have you ever heard of the glycocalyx? So far, nobody has heard of it. I must have asked 150 doctors. All right, it's like, so you tell me you understand heart disease and you've never heard of the most important single structure in your
Even cardiovascular doctors.
Well, especially cardiovascular doctors.
Oh, well.
They've never heard of it, all right? And
Wow, that's incredible.
so important, all right? So if your glycocalyx is damaged, then the endothelial cell, the lining cells underneath, will become damaged. So you have to protect your endothelium. You have to protect your glycocalyx. Now, one of the things that really damages your glycocalyx is a high sugar level. You can actually measure this. You can give people a high sugar drink, and you can put a device under people's tongue, which shows very, very small blood vessels, and you can see the red blood cells moving through it. And you can actually, from that, see the thickness of the glycocalyx. All right. So if the glycocalyx is nice and say it's normally that wide, which is obviously not that wide because they're quite small, and you give people a high sugar drink, then the glycocalyx does that. Right.
Wow.
You can see this happening in real time.
Wow.
In fact, you know, I was talking about sepsis. In sepsis, the glycocalyx is hugely damaged, right? It can almost disappear completely. And in some units, so there are doctors who've heard of this, in some units, they measure the thickness of the glycocalyx. And dependent on the thickness of the glycocalyx is a 1-to-1 ratio with how likely you are to die or live, right? Which tells you also that what is happening in sepsis is you are stripping the glycocalyx apart and exposing the endothelial cells underneath, and then they die, right? So you really got to look after this thing in your body. Now, you can measure it. You can go and measure. I was going to buy a thing. It's got a I just forgot it's glyco something. Glyco check, sorry. Which you can stick under the tongue, and you can look at your glycocalyx. And you can also see small blood vessels that have died or been damaged. You can count the number of blood vessels. And you know, when people talk about kidney disease and retinal disease and neuropathy with diabetes, and they almost seem to think we've got a separate disease going on here. It's the same disease as in your larger blood vessels. It's just that within a very small blood vessel, like a capillary, which is like 100 times thinner than a human hair or whatever it is, you couldn't get a plaque there because the plaque would be 5,000 times the size of the blood vessel. So there's nowhere for the plaque to be. But what does happen in the small blood vessels? So if you've got a high blood sugar level, at the back of your eye, you've got all these very small blood vessels, like capillaries and whatever, is that the glycocalyx is damaged, the endothelial cells die, and these blood vessels just die or burst or split apart. All right, this is the same process, and that's called retinopathy, the retinopathy damage. Retinopathy is due to the destruction of small blood vessels, which is due to primarily the destruction of the glycocalyx. The same thing happens in your kidneys, because your kidneys, they've got these very small blood vessels in the glomerular apparatus. And if these die off, then the nephron dies off, and then you develop kidney failure. So people say that chronic kidney disease, which is the destruction of your kidneys, is a cause of heart disease. And I go, no, heart disease is a cause of chronic kidney disease. You've got this the wrong way. You've got it the wrong way around, right? And if you get neuropathy, you know, some people with diabetes lose the feeling in their fingers. Neuropathy. Well, why does that happen? It's because the very small blood vessels in your fingers and your toes are not being supplied by the very small blood vessels because they've died. So what happens is you get nerve death following this, so you lose your sensation in your fingers. It's also why you get ulcers, and because you start to lose the blood supply to your skin a bit, so ulcers don't heal up. So essentially, I know you're saying biomarkers. Essentially, to me, heart disease is very, very atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is very, very simple. It's you ask yourself 2 or 3 questions, which is, the first one is what does something damage the lining of your blood vessels, right? And if the answer is yes, then that will increase the risk of heart disease. And you can look at things that seem way out there. The disease that has the highest rate of cardiovascular disease gives you the highest risk of cardiovascular disease. A 50,000% increase in risk of dying of cardiovascular disease is sickle cell anemia. Right? So, well, how can that cause it? I said, well, the sickle cell anemia, which you probably heard of, is a disease of red blood cells. It's a genetic condition. And if you have severe sickle cell anemia, all your blood vessels look a bit like sickles, like a sickled moon or whatever. And you can imagine you've got blood vessels that should be round and squidgy are now sharp and pointy, and they're crashing through your blood vessels. Well, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to strip the lining off. That's exactly what does happen. I was looking at a study of there was a 7-year-old boy who had to have his right leg amputated because he had such severe narrowing and atherosclerosis of his leg. And they looked, all his blood vessels were full of calcification and damage, right? This is a 7-year-old boy. His brother died of a stroke. He had sickle cell disease, has sickle cell disease, right? And you say, well, what else does he have? There's nothing else. It's the only thing that's wrong with him, right?
But he will have a lot of damage besides the artery part of the body, right? He will also have a lot of damage elsewhere, probably.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, they have strokes and they have heart disease, and the main problem actually happens in your spleen because, as you may know, red blood cells are broken down in your spleen, and they go there for changeover. But so if you look at people with sickle cell disease and look at the arteries in their spleen, they're all full of atherosclerosis. I mean, it was not known before because before they did blood transfusions and genetic treatment, the average age of death with severe sickle cell disease was 3. Right? So there wasn't much time, and you died of other things. But only once they started living longer did they start to see the longer-term sequelae or problems that are associated with this. So you get other conditions. Another condition that damages your blood vessels is Kawasaki's disease. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a condition. It's an infection. They don't know what the infection agent is. It affects young children, and it causes what they call a vasculitis. Vasculitis means inflammation of the vascular system. Itis just means inflammation. So tonsillitis is inflammation of the tonsils, and appendicitis is inflammation of the appendix. Vasculitis is inflammation of the vascular system, and that is caused when the body starts to attack its own vascular system. It's a kind of autoimmune effect, all right? With Kawasaki's disease, you get quite a severe vasculitis, and it can last for a few weeks. And children who get Kawasaki's disease can die of heart attacks, myocardial infarction, aged 4, right? Because it's really stripped apart their coronary arteries at the same time, right? So there's another example of, what are you looking for? You're looking for things that can damage your blood vessels. Doesn't really matter which one. It tends to be the arteries because they're under the greatest stress. You don't tend to get plaques developing, or you don't get plaques developing in veins or whatever. So you need a certain amount of blood pressure to be putting the system under enough stress, if you like. What else causes it? Cocaine. When you take cocaine, people take cocaine, the middle of the nose falls out, right? Why does the middle of the nose fall out? Cocaine triggers a really severe vasculitis, right? Notice if you've got it stuck inside your nose, the blood vessels inside your nose all die, and so the middle of your nose falls out. That's what happens. Right? And so young men taking cocaine, it's the biggest risk factor for premature cardiovascular disease in young men is cocaine use. Right? Again, what are we looking at? We're looking at damage to the blood vessels, damage to the blood vessels, damage to the blood vessels, damage to the blood vessels. Then you get blood clots forming. Yes. Then the blood clots can grow. Well, those areas where the blood clots form, you get repeated blood clotting, blood vessel narrows, and eventually blocks up completely. I mean, I'm giving a few talks up in Scotland. I was just looking at this again. If you look at what they call plaques, there's things in arteries, all right, and that's the thickenings that cause heart disease and stroke. So, is if you look at them, a lot of them look like tree trunk, or if you cut the tree trunk, you see layers. And when you look at the plaques inside arteries, they've got layers. Most of them have layer after layer after layer after layer. It's what causes layers to cool? Well, that's repeated blood clotting at the same point. Blood clotting repair, blood clotting repair. It's like blatantly obvious what's going on here. I'd like to say this was all my own idea and I thought of it myself, and I am very clever. But it was first thought of in 1852 by a guy called Karl von Rokitansky, 175 years ago. A guy in Vienna was looking at this and going, this is what heart disease is. He didn't call it heart disease at that time. Right?
Wow.
I was taught at Aberdeen University by a cardiologist, a female cardiologist called Elspeth Smith, who has written papers on this, or wrote papers on this 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And she said, basically, blood clotting is responsible for all of the creation of plaques from the start through to the finishing final blood clot. She said, there's other people who've said this as well. I mean, fantastically interesting research where they got chickens. And what they did was they introduced blood clots into their veins, right, and their arteries. They introduced blood clots into the chicken, and they started to develop clots wherever plaques wherever these blood clots got stuck. It's like it's been staring people in. It's been staring people in the face for 175 years. It's like there's the alternative explanation. You have two explanations. You have one which is that cholesterol causes heart disease. And you say, well, okay, tell me how an LDL molecule damages the lining of an artery or even gets into an artery wall. Tell me how does that happen? No one can tell you how that happens. There's no evidence at all.
No evidence, yeah.
There's just, and if you say, okay, well, it's because of a concentration gradient. I mean, no, it's not, because it can't be because of a concentration gradient, because you can't have a concentration gradient in a solid, all right, and a liquid. It doesn't exist. So this idea that something moves out of a liquid into a solid down a concentration gradient is just incoherent gibberish, all right. And then the other, I mean, if you're looking at it, I used to use this argument, but I've kind of given up on it because it doesn't seem to impress people greatly. But the arteries that are big enough to have plaques in them, or atherosclerosis, or atherosclerotic plaques, or whatever term you want to use, have their own blood vessels. They're called the vasa vasorum, the blood vessels of the blood vessels. All right. Now you say, so what? I'm going to go, well, when you have really small blood vessels, capillaries, things can leak out of capillaries and leak back in. Otherwise, there'd be no point in having capillaries, because everything would just travel around the body and get stuck. So you have these blood vessels where things can leak out, all right? And LDL can leak out of capillaries, the vasa vasorum, that are inside your blood vessels, right? But there are more vasa vasorum in your veins than there are in your arteries, right? So if LDL can leak out of the vasa vasorum that exist within your blood vessels, why the hell isn't it leaking out into a vein? Why is it only doing it in arteries if it's a concentration gradient? What are you talking about? I mean, it's just incoherent gibberish. The cholesterol hypothesis. I used an example which was Isaac Newton, hugely impressive and brilliant man. Most of his working life was spent trying to turn lead into gold. He was an alchemist, right? And he must have thought, and people must have thought, well, lead, it's a metal, it melts at whatever it melts at, about the same as gold, and they're quite heavy and they're both metals. It surely must be possible to turn one into the other. You go, well, yes, until you understand atomic theory, and then you realize it's quite difficult. And what you need is a collapsing supernova before you can transmit one element into another. And so the idea with cholesterol was kind of like, well, we've got cholesterol and we eat it, and then we get cholesterol in the bloodstream, and then it gets out of the bloodstream into the artery wall. Well, that sounds very simple. It's a very simple story. But once you start to understand how the body works, it's like, it's the same thing. No, it's not difficult for this to happen. It's actually impossible. This is a stupid idea. And yet people still cling to it. You can't explain it. It's like, you ever seen the film Inception? And it's a great film. I loved it. And one of the strap lines is, what's the most resilient parasite? And the answer is, it's an idea. Right. Once you get an idea in someone's head, it sticks there and you can never get it out. Stuck forever. The whole point of Inception was to try and insert an idea into someone's brain and make them pretend it was their idea. Once people have decided, once they look at the cholesterol, it goes, well, it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, it's cholesterol and it's cholesterol and it's cholesterol. Yeah, I know it's simple, but it's just complete gibberish. There's no part of it you can explain that makes any sense. And yet it holds everyone in this kind of thrall. And then people say, well, what about statins? They lower cholesterol and they protect against heart disease. Well, it's true, they lower LDL levels, and there is some very minute amount of protection. But I can tell you something about statins, I was just reading this yesterday, so it's fresh in my mind. Statins have a secondary effect, which most people don't know about, is they increase nitric oxide synthesis in endothelial cells and the glycocalyx. And they stimulate the production of new endothelial cells. Now, why they do this, it's just a coincidental thing that they do. There's your explanation for how they work. It's got nothing to do with the lowering of the LDL. It's completely nothing to do with it.
So that's interesting, maybe, because I have type 1 diabetes, and I found it very interesting that you started about the glycocalyx. That's, I understand, the main mechanism behind the damage, maybe in retinopathy and all those things.
Yes.
And so if you have diabetes and no heart disease symptoms, would it be a wise idea almost to take statins just to sort of, I'm joking a bit, of course, but to counteract the glycocalyx damage?
There are better things you can do to damage
your
glycocalyx. Right? You can eat beetroot, for example. That raises your nitric oxide. You can go out into the sun, because sunshine stimulates nitric oxide synthesis throughout your entire body. All right. It's one of the best ways of doing it. You can take exercise. That's good. But of course, with type 1 diabetes, you're in a type 2 diabetes is slightly different in that with type 2 diabetes, you've got high insulin levels and high sugar levels and metabolic dysfunction going on. In theory, with type 1 diabetes, if you can take the exact right amount of insulin to keep your blood sugar under control, then you shouldn't be at greater risk. The problem occurs with type 1 diabetes is that people were told to control their blood sugar level with insulin so you could eat lots of carbohydrates, which was just completely stupid idea. I mean, if you got type 1 diabetes, you really want to be eating a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, reducing your insulin need, and in that way, you will keep things much better for your glycocalyx and your endothelium and all these things. So they're giving everyone the whole type 2 thing is, you've got type 2 diabetes. Well, you can't eat fat because that increases your risk of heart disease. So you must eat carbohydrates.
Yeah, this is something.
Be more stupid.
Yeah,
but this is the advice that officially we were given. I mean, this is incoherent. I mean, I lost interest in diet some time ago once I realized it didn't cause heart disease. But increasingly, I look at it and just think, this is just incoherent gibberish. Again, it's just exactly the wrong advice, isn't it?
It's honestly, we're doing this a couple of months now, Malcolm, and we're always talking about this, and especially with the carbohydrate model. And it's absolutely crazy because and everybody else knows here, that everybody's talking about carbohydrates. They're all saying that's essential. But I firmly believe that, okay, if you're young, you can probably get away with it. But I firmly believe that when you get older, you're not going to get away with this anymore. It's going to catch up on you, and these foods will kill you eventually.
Well, it's the repair system I was talking about earlier. Why you can probably smoke 20 cigarettes a day when you're 20, 30, 40. But as you get older, your repair systems, I'm afraid, start to get not so good. And so things start to go wrong. As you say, when you're young and otherwise fit and healthy, your repair systems are going fine. If you've got a good endothelial repair, you can probably get away with a lot. I mean, with people that smoke until they're 100 years old and whatever. So it's, why is this happening? It's because a lot of people are better at repairing things. I mean, when we talk about the repair systems, one of the systems that is involved in repair and is damaged is using steroids, glucocorticoids, which they use in a lot of actual autoimmune diseases, ironically. So if you take a steroid, not necessarily the cream, all right, but if you take a steroid for things like rheumatoid arthritis or whatever, the risk of heart disease is hugely increased. Now, in part, they do increase blood sugar levels, yes, but also they say they're anti-inflammatories. And anti-inflammatories, of course, if your problem is inflammation, you need your inflammation controlled. But inflammation is also another word for that is healing, all right? If you have high cortisol, corticosteroids in your system, your healing processes are severely damaged. There was a situation when it happened, this was in the 1950s, where they looked at people who'd had a heart attack and they looked at their hearts and they said, oh, there's inflammation going on. Well, big surprise. You've had a lot of damage in your heart. There's inflammation. This is your body trying to heal itself. Anyway, they decided we're going to damp down the inflammation by giving people high-dose steroids, all right? Now, what was the end result of this? Was actually the healing process was severely hampered. The heart muscle completely, thinned out, and actually people's hearts got aneurysms and burst, all right? So they thought they were doing good by getting rid of the inflammation, but the inflammation, another word for inflammation, healing, all right? Because that's what the body's trying to do. It might be going wrong at times, but this thing about inflammation, now a lot of people are saying heart disease is an inflammatory condition. It's like, I show people a picture of a broken ankle and it's red and it's swollen around it. And I go, what do you think happened here? The inflammation got worse and worse and worse and the ankle broke. So no, I think you'll find somebody broke their ankle and then it became inflamed. That's the body trying to heal itself. If you get a spray, you used to have rest, ice, compression, elevation, right? They've got rid of that. You probably don't know they've got rid of that, but actually they found that, but by reducing the inflammation, they reduced the healing, and actually you get worse results. Inflammation is a sign of your body trying to heal itself. If you interfere with that process, you cause damage. Now, steroids are the most potent anti-inflammatory agent we have, and they increase the risk of heart disease by 600 to 700% if you take them long term, all right? And they found that actually a lot of the other immunosuppressant drugs that they use, the non-steroidal ones, cause a great increase in the risk of heart disease as well. Why? Because once you've damaged your lining of your blood vessels, you need to heal after that. And if you interfere with that healing process, you're getting a defective healing process going on. A bit like if you give steroids to people who've had heart attacks. Well, it gets rid of the inflammation, yes, and destroys the heart at the same time. This inflammation thing it's an obsession of mine. It's like going nuts. Inflammation can't cause anything. Inflammation is caused by things. And it can go on to cause damage if you have an autoimmune disease going on. Yes, that's true. But it's mostly you don't want to get rid of this. So you want to make sure your healing system is as good as possible as well. And the one thing that will damage your system of healing more than anything is chronic psychological stress. Because that causes
that goes back to cortisol, doesn't it?
It's cortisol. Well, there's plenty of stress hormones. I think cortisol is the key one. I don't know. Because if people who develop Cushing's disease or syndrome, where they produce too much cortisol in their adrenal glands, right? These people, they develop central obesity, they develop diabetes, they develop raised VLDL, they develop low HDL, they develop high blood sugar levels. The metabolic syndrome that you'd call it, or whether you call it metabolic syndrome or insulin resistant syndrome, or when I first came across it, it was called Reevens syndrome. And before that was called Syndrome X. This condition has had many different names over 40 years, all right? It's now called pre-diabetes. I don't know what it's called anymore. It doesn't really matter. It's the same thing anyway. But if you give people high levels of cortisol, they develop the metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And they develop a hugely high rate of heart disease, all right? If you're under psychological stress, you will be producing too much cortisol chronically, all right? But then a strange thing happens as you start producing too little cortisol, right? Because your system just starts to break down. There's a guy, if you ever get a chance, look at work by Bjorn Torp and Rosen, who did a huge amount of work on chronic psychological stress and the metabolic syndrome and central obesity and heart disease and blah, blah, blah. They just got this completely 30, 40 years ago. I used to read their stuff and spoke to them a few times. Unfortunately, he's now dead. The thing most people don't know is actually it was first discovered in the First World War, is that men who suffered from shell shock, which we now call PTSD, I think, severe shell shock, they developed sugar in their urine. They developed type 2 diabetes. Severe depression causes type 2 diabetes. But it doesn't cause type 2, it increases because the hormones are released that are antagonist into insulin, and your blood sugar goes through the roof. Right. It's also called post-aggression metabolism. So if you're in a car crash or you have an operation, you become instantly insulin resistant to a huge degree, and your blood sugar level goes through the roof. But your psychological effect will do this as well. The people who have the highest rate of heart disease as a general population are schizophrenics, right? And they have enormously high cortisol levels shooting around in their body. They're a very high stress level all the time. So psychological stress, I used to think it was the cause of heart disease. I created a whole argument as to why everything was due to psychological stress, and then realized that it wasn't. But it's a hugely important factor in damaging your neuropsychological, it's all the hormonal system, the sympathetic system, all these things, that the fight and flight response and all these things. They're very damaging to your cardiovascular system at the same time, for all the same reasons that I've sort of outlined, and they damage the healing system. So psychological stress is hugely important.
Yeah, I think like stress on its own, there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of cortisol. We know how important cortisol is, but it's when it gets elevated, that's where it becomes a problem.
Oh yeah, well currently the population, I think, with the highest rate of heart disease are Australian Aboriginals. Or they call Torres Strait Islanders now, I think they call themselves. And they did a study of this population, and they found that young men, well, normally with cortisol, when you wake up in the morning, it's high, and then it goes down. At lunchtime, it goes up, it goes down. It does this cycling thing. What they found was that young Torres Island Australians don't have a morning peak. It's gone. They don't respond anymore to stress like that. They don't actually produce any more cortisol. Their system is now burnt out.
Okay.
They have a gigantic problem with this, and they've done the same. The Maoris in New Zealand and the First Nations in Canada and America are the same. These people have hugely high rates of heart disease. The Nepalese, in fact, I did a study. The last time I looked at it, I was looking at rates of heart disease. The top 20 countries in the world, I think it was, 12 of them were ex-Soviet Union countries.
Wow.
The other ones were Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. Anyway, you can guess the rest. Somalia, right?
And what happens in this case? Are they cortisol resistant, or does the cortisol production go down and you lack actually the peaks for functional reasons?
Right. Now you're in an area where I can't quite work out what's going on. We know what they say with type 2 diabetes. You have insulin resistance, and your insulin goes higher and higher. Then eventually you can reach a point where it kind of says your pancreas gives up, and your insulin drops, and then you actually diagnose type 2 diabetes. I think it's quite as simple as that. I think what happens if you get a chronic state of negative stressors that overwhelm your system, it blunts out. All right. Now, quite exactly what happens there, because there's all these things about the effect of cortisol in fat cells and how it operates and how it refigured. If you can work it out, come and tell me. I can't work out exactly what's going on here. But what you've got is what you call a neurohormonal dysfunction of some sort. I'm speaking to a guy, David Diamond, who does a lot of work in neuropsychology, looking at people who've got PTSD and stuff like this. And you can actually see that the nerve cells in certain parts of their brain have actually just died out. Right. So there's something going on. If you look at schizophrenics, they actually have enlarged pituitary glands because they're under so much stress that the pituitary glands are bigger. Now, I think when the system starts to go wrong, it becomes so complexly wrong that it's very difficult to say exactly what's going on. Somebody will work it out. I haven't worked it out. I haven't worked out what's happening with cortisol. But put it this way, it's a dysfunctional system, and when that happens, you are at very high risk of dying of heart disease. They did a study in Lithuania and Sweden, and at the time, Lithuania had a very high rate of heart disease, and the only different factor they could find was psychological measures of depression and anxiety and feelings of hopelessness and blah, blah, blah. and they had 6 times the rate of heart disease of the Swedish population. It's called the Lidköping something study, which is fascinating. You know, when the wall came down in the USSR, when the rate of heart disease in Lithuania was first. The rate of heart disease was going down like that. It doubled over 3 years and came back down again. And that exact same pattern can be seen in all of these ex-Soviet Union countries. Russia was a couple of years later. The Russian rate doubled, then it went down, then it had a huge banking crisis, then it went up again, and then it went down. It's quite so you can almost monitor the this what I call the psychosocial stress, if that's the correct term.
Yeah, so there will be one for the COVID pandemic as well, probably. Right?
I predicted we would see more heart disease after the COVID pandemic, and we have seen more heart disease after the COVID pandemic. Now, that might be mixed up with the fact that SARS-CoV-2 actually does have problems with the cardiovascular system, so you need to disentangle that. But there's no doubt. I mean, which country was first to have a high rate of heart disease? Might have been the USA, right? The USA had the Great Depression, had huge rates of immigration. Then they had the Second World War, and their heart disease rate went like that, and then went like that. The next country in the world to have a really high rate of heart disease was Finland in the 1960s, right? And you think, well, Finland is a nice little country up there. Not much happens. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Russians took over a region of Finland called Karelia and shifted 1.5 million people. They just displaced them into Karelia. The largest forced relocation of people in the history of the world. And the rate of heart disease went through the roof. And it especially went through the roof in the region of Karelia, right? That was the highest region. I see someone's right. Is heart disease still increasing, though, now? Depends what countries you're looking at. We become very Eurocentric. Heart disease in India is going like this at the moment.
Yeah.
Like that. It's going up. It's doubled in the last 10 years, I think.
Well, I'm thinking now that all these are examples of quite acute problems, wars or depressions. So maybe the last few decades, could we see also, like, I don't know when it started, did it start go up in the 60s or so, that this slightly less steep slope, that it's sort of the same thing as well, related to social stress but more secondary.
I think a lot of people, I think the Second World War was quite a major thing for a lot of Europe in many ways. But of course, you're not looking at a lot of people lived through that when in their 20s. By the time we're getting to the 40s and 50s, we're talking about the 1970s and 80s. This is when you're going to die of the disease, if you like. That's sort of what happened in Scotland. The other thing that happened in Scotland was Glasgow had a population of about 1.5 million, and about 500,000 of the population of Glasgow, more than that, were taken out of what they called the tenements and put into new towns around Glasgow. So they're basically forcibly relocated into social housing. And in Scotland, that's where the rate of heart disease was at its highest, is in these areas of what you call social dislocation. There's a population that fascinated me for years. It's called the Rosetta community. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. No. There's a place in sort of the boot of Italy called Rosetta. It was a town, and virtually everybody there moved to the States. About 20,000 people in the end, to a Rosetta in Pennsylvania. Okay, and it was found that there wasn't a single case of heart disease in Rosetta till about 1968. Right? Whether that's entirely true, I don't know for sure, but it was very, very low. But what happened was that they sort of transported their community, if you like. So they had churches, and they had family, and they had christenings, and they had the whole thing was very much like it had been in Italy, right? And their heart disease rate remained very low. And when they studied them, what they found was these people had a terrific sense of social connection and friendships and worship and all these sort of things went on. As that disappeared, their rate of heart disease went up to join the rest of the United States. So they kind of what happened there, because in general, the populations that have the high immigrant populations tend to have much higher rates of heart disease. Specifically in the UK, for instance, that would be true of, and in order, it's the Muslims from Pakistan and Bangladesh that have by far the highest rates of heart disease. Then you have the Hindus, then you have the Sikhs on a kind of level like this. And then you have the Chinese community who have a half of the rate of heart disease of the UK population. So it's very, immigration per se is not necessarily damaging, but it kind of depends how you fit into the community you're within. The Muslim population in Sweden have 6 times the rate of heart disease of the surrounding population. And in the UK, it's about 4 times the rate, right? And you could say this is perhaps an example of racism and other things going on that make these people feel very isolated and under pressure.
Yeah.
So these things are very important. They're clearly very important. And you say, well, how does that become heart disease? The connection is, I say it's through what I call, and I use this term psychosocial stress, which other people have used, and I think you sort of know what it means, but it might be quite difficult to actually say what exactly it is. So when you're coming to heart disease, yes, there's a lot of these biomarkers, and researchers become very obsessed with measuring things and sugar levels and insulin levels and levels of this, that, and the next thing. But actually, there's more general things that I think are very important. They did a fascinating study, which I think I mentioned it in the Clot Thickens, maybe it was somewhere else, was they looked at little counties in Northeast America, and somebody said, let's look at how many sort of nasty posts people are making, right? So critical posts and being horrible, whatever, right? Not quite entirely sure how they decided this, right? And the rates of heart disease in those areas. And it's like you could put one graph on top of the other. The more negative and horrible the comments were from this little place in wherever it was, the higher the rate of heart disease. And the more positive and gentle they were, the lower the rate of heart disease. It was like, you can't believe how closely it relates, right? So you've got sort of 500 points of data. It's like one sits on top of the other. I don't know how you would redefine that, but I think it's really important. And I think when I say to people, what's the most important thing you can do to prevent heart disease? It would be, chill. Go outside, have a walk. Don't let people bully you. Don't let people be horrible to you. Have good friendships, have good social support systems. These, you've heard of the blue zones? Blue zones?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy that did it wanted to prove that it was all diet. Well, he never proved this was rubbish. What he proved was that the reason why different communities had lower rates of heart disease was if they were really socially supportive of each other. And they had friends and friendships and social groups and things like this. This was the most important factor by a million miles. And I've got blue zones sitting there in my book somewhere. And yet still the guy says, well, it's obviously to do with diet. And in fact, one of the places I looked at was Sardinia. And in fact, the Sardinians wrote to I can't remember his name now, that wrote the book, saying basically, well, you're completely wrong. We don't eat vegetarian diet. We eat pigs and sheep and things. And it's just rubbish, but he just wanted to make his findings fit, which I find is a very common thing. What really happened was these communities were good, positive, closely knit communities where people got on with each other. And that's, you can't really measure that scientifically, can you? So.
No, and it's also very difficult to tell whether it's a primary or secondary cause, right? It's really difficult.
Yes, but it's slightly, we moved away from talking about LPA and biomarkers. I think we medicine's obsessed with bloody things like this, of measuring your blood pressure and this and that, and if you can't measure it, it doesn't count. As Einstein said, most things that can be counted don't count, and most things that count, I don't know, I'll get it right. Most things that can be counted don't count, and most things that can't be counted. And medicine should still be seen in that way. Is just because you can't count it doesn't mean it's not important. I used to have it as my screensaver, which was most things that can be measured don't matter, and most things that matter can't be measured. I used to bounce around on my computer.
Yeah.
And I think we do get too wound up with type 3 HDL oxidation, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, come on.
Okay, can we move on? And because there's a guy on that usually does our podcast with us, and he wants to ask you a question. I think we have that up now, Peter. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Just give me 1 second. So this guy's name is Tony. Just wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're ready, here we go.
Ready to go? Yeah.
Hey guys, what's up? Dr. Kendrick, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there. I really wanted to meet you, and I've been a fan of your work for a very long time. When I first heard who you were, it was through Ivor Cummins and your talks. And man, I loved the Clot Thickens. What a great read. And I'm a big supporter of it. And my family, people that have been, with questioning heart disease, it's in my opinion, one of the go-tos. Thank you for being with us. And a question for you. I have somebody who is, they've discovered plaquing. They've got, they're doing all the things that we believe is right. Like, eating an ancestral diet, lots of meat, fat. They're worried about the plaque progressing. And aside from obviously doing another coronary score, the statin question comes up. They still want him on statins, and I just want your thoughts. Maybe you could tell him, what is, in your opinion, is it worth it to take a statin, even though he hasn't had an event? He has some plaquing present, but yet he's doing all the things that we're in this sort of community. He's pretty much a carnivore, fermented foods. Good quality whole food ingredients, and is there, what are your thoughts on including a statin to that? Thanks. Have a great show, everybody. Thanks for being there, Dr. Kendrick. We really appreciate it.
Well, the statin question comes up an awful lot because people are under a huge pressure. In the UK, we have a thing called the Quality Outcome Framework, which I don't know if you have in Ireland, which is basically a list of all the things you're supposed to do as a GP for your patients. So you weigh them and you measure them. But there's a lot of the latest cholesterol indicators have come out, and basically they've lowered the level of LDL at which you should be taking a statin and lowered the age and da-da-da-da. So the entire medical profession is, at least superficially, of one mind. You should be taking a statin. Now that's very difficult to go against, because I have people ask me, what doctor can I speak to in Britain that shares your views? Well, none in public. So therefore the whole statin question, I have discussed the fact that statins have some benefits. I think I would say that you have to make your own mind up on this, and people will have to make their own mind up on this. But the statistic I like came from a study done by Christensen in about 2012. He looked at the statin trials and said, well, why are you taking a statin? The most important thing is to not die, right? So it's to live longer, or however you want to determine that. And they looked at that time, the 6 major trials that had been done, and then said, well, what is the average increase in life expectancy, assuming the trials are correct and there's no bias and no whatever? The answer was, if you took a statin for 5 years and you had no pre-existing heart disease, or at least no diagnosed pre-existing heart disease, the average increase in life expectancy was 3 days. Right, 3 days. So there's 0.6 of a day per year. If you had pre-existing heart disease, it was 4.2 days, which is 0.75 of a day per year. And that, they present this as like a 20% reduction in this and a 25% reduction in that. That's statistical manipulation. I haven't got time to explain how they manage that. But if you want to read doctoring data, I do go through that ridiculousess. Christensen 2015, the effect of statins on average survival, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, thank you. And I almost got the year right, I think. Which is quite impressive. And anyway, I was trying to get it published in the BMJ, which was the same study. I worked with a guy who did a thing called RMST, reduction in mean survival time. But the answer is you will live about half a day longer, maybe on average per year if you take a statin, according to the clinical trials. Right? Now you can make a decision: is that worth it or not? I don't think it. I think you spend at least half a day going to the pharmacy and getting your prescription, and then taking the tablets, and then getting blood tests, and you'd probably waste more of your life than you would save per year. And that assumes that they have no adverse effects whatsoever. All right. Now I think statins have quite a lot of adverse effects. I know that the mainstream have come out with this utterly bogus study saying that they have no adverse effects whatsoever. You got to bear in mind is, when you get a box of tablets and there's a big huge thing in them about patient information, which no one ever reads, and in Britain it's usually in Polish because that's where the drugs come from now.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you look at the adverse effect on statins that they have to do, and this comes from the clinical trials, so it has to be accurate. All right, they're legally required to do this. Okay, so if you look at adverse effects from statins, they say about 10% might get muscle pain, brain fog, blah blah blah. So this is what they found in the clinical trials. All right, otherwise they wouldn't put it on their stuff. Now I've spoken to many people. The first person, he's now sadly died, is my father-in-law. Had terrible heart disease, blocked arteries, and was put on a statin, and reached the point where he couldn't walk anymore. He literally couldn't get out of his seat and walk. Right. Now, of course, he wouldn't listen to me because his doctor had said you must take them. I said, well, try going off them for a couple of months and see what happens. He got back. He was able to walk fine. He could walk down. He could go and get his paper and everything like that. He went to his GP, who said, well, it's not the statins causing this. You must go back on them. Right. He went back on them. He couldn't walk. That's what I call a challenge re-challenge. Right. In fact, I was speaking to there was a Dutch television company a couple of years ago. I was sitting in my kitchen having a chat with them about statins, and I said, and one of the things statins cause, which is not even written down anywhere, is that they seem to cause a great deal of people to become quite irritable, really angry about stuff, right? And this was actually somebody doing an electrician was doing some stuff next, in my kitchen at the same time, and he said, my wife's just gone on statins, and you're describing exactly what's happened to her. All right. Okay, so I had a lady who was about to have what they call a laparoscopy, which is you open up the abdominal wall and look inside, because she was getting such severe stomach pains that and no one could find out a cause for it. I said to her, look, stop the statin and see what happens. She came back 2 weeks later and said all the pains have gone. All right. People get brain fog. They get look. Cholesterol is a hugely important chemical in your body. Outside of water, I think it's the second most, probably is. Makes up 25% of the weight of your brain, the dry weight of your brain. Makes up your neurons, makes up your hormones. And the idea that you can start blocking this off and you're not going to suffer any problems. When in Merck were the first company to market statins, and they did work on them, and they realized that one of the things that statins does is it interferes with the production of coenzyme Q10. Now, where they block the production of cholesterol it's like a tree, if you like, and that tree has branches that branch out. At the top of one of those branches is cholesterol. Top of another branch are things like dolichols, and the top of the other branch is coenzyme Q10. So you're not just blocking cholesterol synthesis, you're blocking the production of a lot of other things at the same time. Now, why is coenzyme Q10 is probably a lot of your people have heard of it. It's a cofactor in your mitochondria in the production of ATP. Now, people haven't heard of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. It is the energy. It is the battery in an electric car. It's the petrol in your car. Everything, all of your metabolism to do with energy production ends up making ATP. That is the single chemical that produces all of the energy that runs your body. Right? Everything runs off ATP. Okay. Now we have and coenzyme Q10 is involved in the step of producing ATP. And if you don't have coenzyme Q10, you can reduce your ATP synthesis by 50%. So you're going to think, well, that surely isn't a great thing to be doing, right? To be reducing the single energy supplying chemical in your body by 50%, right? Now, Merck knew this because they'd done work on animal research. And when they were about to launch the statin, they were going to launch it with supplemental coenzyme Q10. So you take 2 tablets at once, take a statin and coenzyme Q10. Now, and they put in patents out. I've got the patent applications somewhere on my computer somewhere. I can find them, I'm sure. Anyway, so you think, well, they then decided, well, it's not going to look very good if you have to take a tablet that also has the antidote to the tablet simultaneously. Not going to make it sound terribly safe. So they never launched that, all right? So what's the commonest adverse effect of a statin is muscle pain, right? Why are you getting muscle pain? Because your muscles aren't working terribly well. Why aren't your muscles working terribly well? Because you haven't got enough ATP. All right, now most of us are probably only using 20% of our ATP that we need every day or something. But as you get older, your reserves reduce. Now they looked at statins, a study in Austria where they gave statins to athletes who were like running 100 meters in 10 seconds. And it reduced their performance such that they were no longer elite athletes. They couldn't run fast anymore. All right. Now that's an extreme. Most of us may not notice that level of differentiation. We're not trying to run 100 meters in 10 seconds. But as you get older, you will notice this. So statins have a whole series of really quite unpleasant effects on the body. And some people, I don't know how, seem to get no adverse effects. Or maybe they don't even recognize their adverse effects. But to my mind, you're going to live for 0.6 of a day per year longer. And the chances are you're going to get a whole series of... I used to have a saying, I said to patients, which was, statins add 15 years to your life. And they go, well, that's fantastic. I go, no, they don't make you live 15 years longer. They just make you feel 15 years older.
Older, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And they laughed, and I went, well. And I think that's, personally, I think that's true. It's like, people say, I'm getting aches here, and I'm getting joint pains, and I'm getting this, and getting that. And then the doctor goes, oh, you're getting older. What do you expect? And well, maybe not to feel this old this quickly. So, in my personal opinion, the benefits, and they have some benefits, are just not worth it. But take them, and then if you have absolutely no adverse effects, and you think, I feel absolutely fine, right? I was playing golf with a chap the other day, and I'd spoken to him about it, and he reckons since he stopped taking his statins, he's added 20 yards to his drive when he drives the ball. Right?
Wow.
Amazing.
Okay, now I don't know if this is true or not, but he's felt the difference. All right, he feels more energetic. He feels better in himself. You know, if you're going to take a drug for the rest of your life, it's going to make you feel blech. I just don't think it's worth it. I mean, I can't make that decision. I'm more of a kind of, I'd rather live a short, happy life than a long, miserable life. For other people, the extent of their life expectancy seems to be hugely important to them, and maybe an extra half a day a year they think is worth it. I can't make that decision on their behalf. All I can do is say, these are the figures, all right? This is what it shows. So, you know, I don't want me, you know, when someone says, what should I say to someone? I say, tell them the facts, and then they can make their decision on their behalf, all right? Because I don't want to say, you made me do it. I'm like, no, I didn't. I just told you what I know. You're deciding. It's not my decision.
I think that's the important message, Malcolm, is that it's your choice. You've got to make that decision what you want to do. Because I had this with my family last year when I lost my parents last year to cancer, and we had this in the hospitals. Okay, what do we do here? And when I walked into the hospital, I said, listen, okay, why are they've been medicated all the time? Like, why are you feeding them sugar all the time? Like, I was asking these people these questions, but they weren't able to give me the answers that I was looking for. And because my parents were so weak, they weren't in a position to answer for themselves. So I felt like I had to do it for them. But because they were so far long gone, then they were literally in the doctor's hands, and it was a bit too late for me in the end. So I think people need to understand that when we look at statins, they might, when we look at medication, and no, you're a doctor, you know better than all three of us. Medication do have their place, but you need to be looking at the foundation and saying, okay, what other things can we focus on first of all before we go down this route?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, the thing I'm writing about was that, you know, this QOF thing I was talking about, where you measure your blood pressure and your cholesterol, it's led to what I'd say is polypharmacy, millions of different medications. All are being, the average medication, I can't give you the exact statistic, but I think the average 60-year-old is now on 7 medications in the UK. In America, it's more than that, right? And you would say, well, if you're on all these medications and they've all been proved to be beneficial, then surely what we would be seeing is people living longer. The reality is, in the last 10 years in the United Kingdom, our life expectancy has reduced, and the healthy life expectancy has reduced even more proportionately. Now, when this first came in, this quaff thing in 2005, I think it was, I argued, I said, this is not going to benefit the health of people because they'll just be given more and more medications. And in the end, the burden of that's going to overwhelm any potential advantages that we see. And when I started as a doctor, we were told no one should be on more than 5 medications. We've now reached a situation where it seems no one should be on less than 5 medications. It's become ridiculous. And there is a movement called Too Much Medicine, of which I joined briefly and then didn't have the time to spend with it. But there are doctors and others around the world going, we've got to stop this. One time there was a thing about lowering blood sugar levels with medications. There was a study called Accord, I think. We're going back 2007, I think, where they tried to use every possible way of driving people's blood sugar levels down as low as possible on the basis that would be beneficial. So if they used metformin, that didn't work. They'd add insulin and they'd add glycoside. And
are they doing that with Ozempic at the moment?
Sorry.
Are they doing that with Ozempic at the moment? Does Ozempic not do that? Like
it's coming. It's not part of the guidelines yet of these guidelines. But anyway, what they found was if they drove it down, I mean, the target was 7, and they said we'll get it below 6. All right, which those figures have changed. But anyway, that's pretty low. What they found was it increased their mortality by about 25%, trying to get the blood sugar down with all these medications. I was in a meeting and I said, look, these guidelines are wrong because the evidence is that we're trying to drive things down too far. We're causing more harm than good. And these people are like, oh, well, we can't be interfering with this. This is part of the nice guidance. I mean, we're going to be killing people by doing this, The evidence is this will kill people. And yet people are kind of trapped in the headlights. This is I've just been looking into the, we've reached a situation now where we've got what they call evidence-based medicine, which I was all in favor of at one time. I was very early on, I helped to set up the evidence-based medicine group in Oxford. I thought this is a good idea. We should have evidence for things. But unfortunately, the evidence is now distorted, right, by the pharmaceutical industry, essentially. They feed it in. The evidence then becomes part of the guidelines, and then the guidelines become this rigid framework that you can't get out of. So, if you're a GP in the UK and well, actually around the world, or a doctor anywhere, and you say, I don't believe those guidelines are correct, and I'm not going to prescribe this, then you will be struck off, right? Yeah. You will lose your job. Okay. That is a definite, and especially if, say, I didn't put someone on a statin, and a week later they drop dead of a heart attack, right? And the relatives would go, that's your fault. I'd be done, right, at that point. That would be me as a doctor gone. Okay. So we have this very rigid framework, which is why you won't find, you have to make your decisions for yourselves, because the medical profession, unfortunately, I think it's a dreadful thing, has become captured within this framework of rigid guidelines, which you cannot escape from. And you can't go outside of these things at all.
But why are they not held accountable, Malcolm? Like when we look at what's going on in the world at the moment with heart disease and all these other diseases, and we look at what happened during COVID, why wasn't anybody held accountable?
Because then I think you'd have to find like everybody accountable. I don't know. It's too big. It's too big a thing. I mean, we have it. I mean, it's like at all levels. And unfortunately, it is. I was looking at a thing, inclisiran. You may have heard of it. It's a cholesterol-lowering medication. It's a new thing. It's now part of the guidelines for. It's the latest cholesterol thing. It's considered you must be trying to use this and it's a group of my particular nemesis, Oxford University people. They've worked on this drug and they've got it into the guidelines. And there's a little bit at the bottom that says, at the moment, there is no evidence that that inclisiran has any impact on heart disease. Right. So we're now getting drugs pushed in to the system where they don't even have any evidence at all. But they did beyond statins, a thing called PCSK9 inhibitors that lower LDL to a far greater extent than statins, like by 60%. It lowers LDL. And we're looking at this first study that came out on one of the drugs called Repatha. And it stated it reduced the risk of MI, cardiovascular death, and stroke by 20%. That's how they promoted it. That's what was on the paper. And that's how it got onto the market. And now it's part of the guidelines, right? Mm-hmm. People went back and I looked back, and what we found was that actually there were more cardiovascular deaths in those taking Repatha than taking the placebo.
Wow.
More,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
And there were more deaths in people taking Repatha than taking the placebo. There's 444 deaths in the Repatha group and 426 in the placebo group. And this is now in the guidelines, right? Now you're saying, how is no one held responsible for this? Well, in my opinion, we should be going to government with flaming torches and pitchforks and demanding that stakes are put on poles outside Parliament, because this. I've used an example before. There's a man who's in the ESC, Don Poldermans. Don't worry, I'm very well aware of the laws of libel in my life nowadays. I mean, Don Poldermans was part of the European Society of Cardiology. He was in the guidelines, creating guidelines for what they call peri-operative period, which is the period around when you have an operation. Because when you have a major operation, the heart is quite often, you can have heart attacks and things. It's quite a big problem. Anyway, he did research on the use of beta blockers in the peri-operative period. We're going back 30 years here. His research said if you take beta blockers, it reduces the risk of dying of a heart attack in this period by, I can't remember, 10-20%. So it's part of the guidelines, all right? It turns out he falsified his research. That's now was found out, right? Turns out it increased the risk of death in the perioperative period. And a paper came out demonstrating in a 5-year period in Europe, had the guidelines been followed, this would have been responsible for 800,000 deaths.
Wow.
800,000 deaths.
That's genocide, actually.
Crazy.
At that level, yeah.
And there was a drug called Vioxx, which came out from Merck. This is another particularly extraordinary. And they did, Vioxx was used as an anti-inflammatory, a bit like ibuprofen and drugs like that. But it was caused less problem with bleeding and stomach ulcers than the other drugs and the aspirins and things like that. And it was launched. And when it was launched, they did a paper. They knew when they launched the drug that it increased the risk of cardiovascular disease and deaths. Right? They took that section of the paper out and didn't give it to the FDA when they approved it. Right? And that was known because they had it on and this time it was on a floppy disk. And when they reanalyzed the floppy disk, the data could still be recovered. All right, so they knew what they did. They just wiped it out. All right. There was a guy working in the FDA who worked out that over a period of, I think it was 3 years, that was responsible for 55,000 excess deaths. Right.
Wow.
55,000 deaths. So when these people get it wrong, when this happens, you know, going back to this other example, this Repatha, this PCSK9 thing, they actually made up the data in their paper. All right. They had what they call deaths when they didn't know what somebody died of. So it's uncertain as the word is. It's not uncertain, but it's a similar word to that.
Idiopathic.
Sorry?
Idiopathic, probably.
No, it's not idiopathic. No, deaths of uncertain cause. All right. So in the trial, people died. Okay. And you say, what did they die of? Well, somebody suddenly dies. It could be a stroke, a heart attack. I mean, it could be various things. All right. Now, they didn't do any autopsy, so they don't know what they died of, but they had this committee that just moved. They said, these are not uncertain deaths. These are cardiovascular deaths, all right? And by so doing, they actually made the drug look as though it worked in cardiovascular disease, right? So they just made up the figures. And then the drug got onto the market, and it's still on the market. Last I looked, it made $2.5 billion last year in profit, right?
Wow.
Based on a study, there where they made up the figures. Right? Look, I've looked at clinical studies where they weren't getting a good enough result, so they changed the definition of what a myocardial infarction was halfway through the trial. Right? Now you might think, well, someone's either had a heart attack or they've not. Well, actually, no. Okay, you can decide whether or not, depending on whether you use enzyme level A or you use an ECG or anyway, there's a series of different ways you can say someone's had a heart attack. And so you can define it in different ways. And they just decided, we're going to decide this is a heart attack. And then their drug worked, all right? Now, you might think, well, how can they just do? They can't just decide to change things. They do this. They're doing this all the time, all right? Now, people, I'm afraid that most doctors, when I say this to them, they don't want to know, all right? They will not listen to this, all right? Because it's just too big and horrible. It's just too huge a thing, right? You mean they're just making the results up? See, and even worse than that is, of course, once you've had a successful study, so once they've done this study on Repatha that was successful and it's launched, you can never do that study again, ever, right? It can never be repeated. You say, why can't you repeat it? Because the drug has been proven to work, and you can't withhold a proven drug from people in a clinical trial. So you can't do that. So all the statin trials, and I have my doubts about a number of them. I have more than slight doubts about a number of them. All right.
That's interesting. So what would it take actually for this drug to be removed from the market at some point? Because
after a while, I mean, they did one. There was a statin called Cerevastatin, which you've never heard of, Bayer's statin. And during the clinical trial period, everyone said it's wonderful, it's fantastic, there's no safety problems at all. It was then found to cause what they call rhabdomyolysis, which is a condition where your muscles disintegrate, right? And then the disintegrated muscles go to your kidneys and you die of kidney failure. Rhabdomyolysis.
You start peeing Coca-Cola.
You start peeing Coca-Cola and you're dead. Anyway, it was then found, so it can happen, you get post-marketing surveillance, that it increased the risk of rhabdomyolysis by about 9 times as high as any of the other statins, and quite a lot of people died of rhabdomyolysis. And then they did get it off the market. Right now, the cynic would say, well, there was plenty of other pharmaceutical companies who didn't want this statin to be launched, so they went after it. There's a lot of competition in this world, all right? But you can, if something's really killing people, it will probably get picked up. But if something's not saving people, right? If the efficacy is not there, no one's going to pick it up. I mean, one of my arguments with statins is people say, oh, they're saving lives, or this person would be dead if they weren't taking the statin, or whatever it is. It's like, you've no idea, because you don't know that somebody would still be alive or dead. Once you've given it, you're purely reliant on these clinical trials. I can't, if I don't know how many people would have to die above the expected death rate for an individual doctor to even notice, right? I've not, that figure would have to be pretty high. All right. So, or if it didn't save their life, if somebody dies and on a statin, they said, well, you'd have died anyway. If somebody's alive on a statin, they say, well, if you weren't on the statin, you'd be dead. It's like, well, you have no idea, have you? We have to go along with the clinical trial results, because we have no way of knowing in our experience whether it would work or not, unless it killed, I don't know, 10 people a year out of your population that were on it or something. The figure would have to be pretty high, right? So yes, if it makes you go purple and explode, then that's pretty easy to pick up, all right? But if you're having a heart attack and you were expected you might have had a heart attack anyway, no one's going to notice that, all right? So these trials have to be correct. They must be correct. They must be whiter than white and pure as driven as snow. Because otherwise, our guidelines and the things that we prescribe to people you know, we could be doing untold harm if we're not careful. What,
Yeah,
800,000 deaths because one guy made his research up, right? One set of guidelines in one area of cardiovascular medicine, 800,000 people.
Wow.
Give you some idea of how important it is that this stuff is right. Now, I've looked at some of the statin trials. The most influential statin trial was called Jupiter, and it was done by AstraZeneca. And prior to this trial, no study had demonstrated a beneficial impact on overall mortality with statins. All right. Okay, it's been shown in secondary prevention. It's people who had already had heart attacks and strokes. So the vast majority of people that are on statins do not have a previous heart attack or stroke. Right? What they call primary prevention, stopping the first event. Now, the Jupiter study came out to great blare of, it's wonderful, we've actually shown a reduction in overall mortality using statins in primary prevention, right? And once again, the total number, and this is a study that was done on, I think it was 19,000 people. Anyway, the total number of cardiovascular deaths, stroke and heart attack in this study, all right, was 12 in the placebo arm and 12 in the rosuvastatin in the statin arm, right? So there was no change in overall mortality. Cardiovascular mortality. There was a change in overall mortality. Less people died of cancer taking the statin, which has not been seen in any other study before, since, or ever, or after, right? So it was clearly a nonsense finding. So they've marketed it as reducing overall mortality in primary prevention, but it didn't prevent cardiovascular disease. You might think this is incomprehensibly what? You must be talking rubbish here. It's like, no, these are the figures. I didn't make this up. You can actually find them in the paper. It's very difficult to find those figures in the paper, but you can.
Wow.
In fact, there was a cardiologist in France called Michel Delogero who actually worked all this out. I was looked at and went, I can't understand this paper at all. It's just gibberish. And he spent ages and sorted it out. So we're in a situation of like, and because of this paper, of course, then everybody was, now it was beneficial to put people on statins in primary prevention, which included hundreds of millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions of extra people, based on a study that didn't show any benefit on cardiovascular disease mortality, and yet was presented as if it had. They say the one-eyed man in the land of the blind is king, and I say, yeah, sometimes you just feel like poking your eye out because you just, I can't get anybody, I think you people are interested, people listening to this are like, what? Oh my God, I go to a medical, meeting full of doctors and say this, and they just want me to go away, right? They don't want to listen. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't want to be associated with you. They don't want to hear any of these things, all right? And they can't argue against it. They just go, no, this guy's just a maverick. He's not a cardiologist. What does he know? He's, anyway.
But at the end of the day, Malcolm, if you can't win, then what chance do we have?
Well, I think you can win in the end, right? Of course you can. Well, if I didn't think I could win, I would just shut up and go. But there have been times I've thought, if people want to just kill themselves with stupid drugs and doing stupid things, let them. But then I know that actually there's maybe, I don't know how many people are listening to this. Tomorrow night I'm speaking to other people. I'm doing conferences and speaking and write books. And I know I'm having an effect on thousands, tens of thousands of people, right? I know I'm having a positive effect on a lot of people. I haven't changed the whole world. I suspect I never will, and I expect you never will. I'd like to change the whole world. I'd like people to say, you're right, this is what causes heart disease, and blah, blah, blah. But you've got to, in the end, there's a phrase I like is you change the world one conversation at a time. You've got to believe that, I think you do. but it can take a long time for those conversations to come together. All right. You know, I get an increasing number of people wanting me to give talks and speak and waffle on about various things. So I'm making a difference. You're making a difference. You're making a difference right now. Because we're giving people confidence. There's people sitting here thinking, yeah, no, I'm much more certain I'm doing the right thing. All right. And then they'll speak to somebody else. And it may not change their mind, but they might change their mind. It might change, you know, it nothing changes and then everything changes. Right? It's like it's in history. Things move very slowly, then all of a sudden, all right? You never know when that all of a sudden is going to happen, do you? You never know when you're going to suddenly make that thing happen. You can't know that. But it will happen, because in the end, you know, and I know, and we all know here, that the truth and science, it kind of wins in the end, because it doesn't never dies, does it? It's always there. You can concrete over the lawn, and eventually a bit of grass will come through and the concrete will go. You know, it takes a lot of effort to keep the truth down. Okay, it takes a lot of money to keep the truth down. But in the end, the truth is immortal. It never dies.
100%.
Well, that's maybe a good positive note to end for today. I don't know, because we don't want to rob you of your time, of course. I mean, I could listen for hours, but
I was going to say I was going to say the same thing. Like, Malcolm, we want to be respectful of your time, but we would love to have you back on again. I know you're a busy man, but if you're available in the next couple of weeks, because I have so much more I want to talk to you about. I'm pretty sure Peter does, and I'm pretty sure Victoria does. Yeah. So if you're ever available in the next couple of weeks, we'd love to have you on for round two.
My next couple of weeks are not available, but after that, I've got some time. I'm going off to Scotland and doing various things and charging about for the next couple of weeks. So, you know, happy to speak to you guys again. I know it may have gone a bit random. I tend to do this. I tend to go all over the place, but I think that I think there's a kind of awareness and awakeness that needs to happen in it. I don't know. Anyway, you know, hopefully it's helped people here and yourselves, and that you want to know more stuff and be comfortable and be confident in yourself. It's very difficult when you've got the whole world apparently against you, isn't it? You know, it's difficult to keep going sometimes. So groups like this, at least we can nurture our
and this is what it's all about. We're doing these just to spread awareness. That's pretty much this is what's up. So with that said, now let's talk about your upcoming events. Where can people go to see your events coming up, or have you got anything lined up? Where can people go?
Well, I'm going up to Scotland next week to talk. There's a good food project, and I'm giving 3 talks up in Crieff in Scotland, and that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week. After that, I'm going up to Scotland to see my daughter and her new husband. And then there's a meeting coming up in London on the 9th of November. It's a Sunday, if that's the 9th, or if it's the 8th, which will be down in London, which is just being sorted out at the moment, where I'm just going to talk about heart disease and stuff like that. And obviously, if you put in my name into Google or whatever, you'll get all sorts of YouTube things that come up with me waffling away and stuff like that. I know obviously there's the book, the one that I would hope people might want to read would be the Clot Thickens, you know, greatest book ever written.
Amazing book. Yeah. Amazing book. I've read it myself.
No, but you know, as I say, we don't do this for the money, do we?
No. Not here.
Anything you want to say, Victoria?
No, I had so many questions, and the doctor really covered. I had one issue about vitamin supplement therapy. Have you heard about the K2 D3 combination?
Yes.
I think Dr. Ford.
I actually take that in the wintertime.
Do you really? Well, there you go. So do I.
Me too.
We
all maybe.
Vitamin D, I think, is very important. I also take about 1 gram of vitamin C during the winter every day.
Really?
Yep. I don't take very much more than that. I think you could sort of end up taking a million things in your life. I'm thinking about magnesium, because I think magnesium is quite good. and I try to take more potassium. I don't take it as a tablet, but I try and eat things with potassium in it.
And can I just ask a question, Malcolm? What does your diet look like at the moment?
My diet? Oh well,
Are you fully carnivore, keto?
I'm not carnivore. I try to eat low carb. I have like yogurt in the mornings usually, and a salady thing at lunch, and then in the evening it kind of falls apart, and I'll just eat whatever. But, so I'll be having a curry tonight. I'm cooking a curry for myself and my wife tonight. So I think I try to be lowish carbish, but it gets a bit complicated doing that all the time. I would say 50% of my meals are low carb, or maybe 60% of my meals are low carb. Yeah.
Perfect. Anything else you want to say, Peter, before we let him go?
No, I enjoyed listening to your stories. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I kept silent because it was way too interesting to hear all of this. A lot of nice examples and things from history as well. That's nice to hear.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, we'll definitely have to do round two. Malcolm, it's an absolute pleasure, and we'll hopefully speak to you again very, very soon.
Okay. Cheers. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye now.